August 14th, 2024. The sun hung high and heavy over the red rock canyons of Moab, Utah, casting hard shadows on the dust where a construction crew dug the early stages of a foundation for a new eco-lodge. The site had once been marked for oil exploration decades ago, but nothing had ever been built. That afternoon, the men worked in rhythmic coordination machines growling and shovels biting the dirt until one of the backhoes scraped something solid beneath the surface. At first, the operator thought it might be an old pipe or metal drum, but the more they dug, the more deliberate the object appeared. A gray satchel, covered in a film of hardened clay and grit, was wedged between two flat stones that had been purposefully placed over it. Inside the sealed bag was a satellite phone, a sheriff's badge, and a thick envelope bound in rubber bands. The foreman, a man named Trey Mitchell, had worked in enough rural counties to know not to keep things like this quiet. He called the Arches County Sheriff's Office immediately and halted all operations. Within 40 minutes, 2 squad cars pulled up on the ridge above the dig. A deputy named Colleen Price stepped out and studied the find with narrowed eyes. The badge was worn but readable. The name etched on it stopped her cold. It read, Deputy Kyle Reams. Colleen turned the badge over in her hand and remembered the funeral. She had only been a rookie back then, still in academy coursework when they buried Kyle after a supposed accident near Hanksville. That was 11 years ago. The phone still held a charge after all these years, surprisingly. It blinked a green light when connected to a power bank one of the crew had in his truck. Colleen called her supervisor and got the green light to power it on. When it came to life, it vibrated once and showed a lock screen with a standard keypad. She glanced at the envelope, pried it open, and found a note written in red pen. The code was scrawled across the top 1313. No explanation, no signature. She typed the numbers into the phone and it unlocked instantly. Colleen tapped through the phone's call log. Only a few outgoing calls, the most recent made on January 3, 2013. It was a voicemail. She hit play. Static filled the speaker at first, then a woman's voice came through low and breathless. She said she was near the canyon overlook and someone was following her. She said she had seen something she should not have. She whispered that he knew her name. Then the message cut off with the sound of heavy boots on rock and a breath caught in panic. The recording ended abruptly. The deputy stared at the screen for a long time, her throat dry. She scrolled through the contacts. Most were blank or labeled with numbers, but one was marked Nolan H. She tapped it and saw that it matched the listed number for Nolan Holloway, a cattle rancher from north of town. She knew that name too. His daughter, Megan Holloway, had gone missing in January 2013. It had been one of the county's most talked about cases, not just because of how suddenly she disappeared, but because of who had led the investigation. Sheriff Mark Denlin. At the time, Denlin was widely respected, the kind of man who had run unopposed for 3 consecutive terms. People trusted him, but there had always been whispers mostly about how close he had been to the Holloway girl before the disappearance. He was 10 years her senior and had once dated her briefly before moving on. Officially, Megan left the ranch one night in her red pickup and never returned. Her truck was never found. Her body was never recovered. The case cooled after 6 months and was eventually moved to cold case status when Denlin announced a lack of evidence. He never reopened it. Colleen's heart pounded as she looked at the satellite phone again. She knew what this could mean. She also knew who she had to call next. She sent a direct message to Ruth Kim, an independent cold case investigator who had worked with the state attorney's office in Salt Lake before retiring early due to burnout. Kim had since taken on unsolved cases by request and had built a quiet reputation for seeing things others missed. Colleen sent her a copy of the call log photos of the satchel and a typed transcript of the voicemail. She included one line at the end of the message, "We might have found her voice." 2 hours later, Colleen met with the sheriff at headquarters. Sheriff Denlin no longer held the position. He had retired in 2021 under little fanfare. The office was now led by Sheriff Tanya Rhodes, who took the discovery seriously. She ordered a full lock on the site and instructed officers to secure the phone and badge under evidence protocols. Colleen watched as the new sheriff issued a press blackout wanting time to validate everything before the media caught wind. At the same time, Nolan Holloway stood in the wide doorway of his horse barn, unaware that the world had just shifted beneath his feet. He was feeding hay to a row of lean mares, his back stiff and hands calloused from years of labor. Megan's face still hung over his workbench in a curled photograph tacked into the wood with a bent nail. It showed her grinning, windburned, holding a pair of worn gloves in one hand and a thermos in the other. That photo had not moved in over a decade. When the black SUV pulled into the gravel lot outside his home just after 7 in the evening, Nolan stepped out slowly. His boots crunched on dry dirt. He recognized Deputy Colleen Price from town. She climbed out of the vehicle and nodded. Her face said everything before she even spoke. In her hand, she carried a small brown evidence bag. He saw the corner of a sheriff's badge inside. Nolan's breath caught in his chest. She told him they had found something. She told him it was connected to Megan. Nolan did not speak for a long while. He motioned for her to come inside. They sat at the kitchen table surrounded by a wall calendar that still read 2020 and a countertop microwave stained with oil. She placed the bag on the table. He opened it slowly. When he saw the badge, his hand stopped moving. Colleen explained about the voicemail. She offered to play it. He nodded. The recording echoed through the room in a voice he had not heard in 11 years. He listened, not breathing, until the end. He said nothing afterward. He walked to the back door and looked out across the pasture where the fence line ran long and straight to the canyon edge. His hand trembled slightly on the knob. He turned back to Colleen and asked her what came next. Nolan Holloway sat alone in the dim light of his kitchen long after Deputy Price had gone. He kept the small evidence bag on the table, resting one hand beside it like anchoring it would keep time from unraveling again. He had not heard Megan's voice in over a decade, and yet, when the recording played, something inside him stirred that had been buried too long. It was not just her words. It was the way her breath caught mid-sentence, the subtle edge of panic behind the whisper, the sound of her boots on gravel. It felt real. It felt recent. He replayed the message once more before unplugging the phone and storing it back in the bag. He wiped his hands on his jeans and reached for the landline. The number he dialed had not changed since the day he installed it. When the call connected, he asked for Ruth Kim and gave only one reason. They had found something. Ruth Kim did not ask questions over the phone. She arrived the next afternoon in a silver Jeep with out-of-state plates and a notebook already open on her dashboard. She was older than Nolan expected, her hair streaked with silver and tied back in a loose braid, but her eyes missed nothing. She did not waste time with small talk. She asked for everything he knew about that night. Nolan obliged. He told her about the call he never got. He told her about the truck that never returned. He described the things he had kept to himself, the late nights Megan spent pacing the barn, the silence she wore like armor after arguments with Sheriff Denlin, the envelope she once found in her mailbox with photos that had no return address. He had seen the photographs once. They showed her walking near the airstrip, her head turned toward a black SUV. Megan had burned them that same night. Ruth listened carefully and took detailed notes. She asked to see Megan's old room. Nolan hesitated but then nodded. Upstairs, the space was untouched. The bed remained neatly made, the closet still held a row of flannel shirts, and a small dream catcher hung by the window. Ruth scanned the room like a bloodhound, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk where Megan used to write. She found a cracked notebook wedged beneath a loose floorboard. The cover was stained and half the pages were blank, but near the back was a list of numbers, dates, and initials. One date stood out January 3, 2013. Next to it were the letters KR and a timestamp 9:47 p.m. Back downstairs, Ruth opened her laptop and pulled up an old staff listing from the Arches County Sheriff's Department. KR matched with Deputy Kyle Reams, the same man whose badge had been buried with the phone. The timestamp indicated he met with Megan the night she vanished. Nolan's hands balled into fists. If Reams had been there that night, why had no one mentioned it? Why had his name never appeared in any report Ruth promised to dig deeper? She said she needed to know who filed Reams's death certificate. The next day, Ruth paid a visit to the county records building a sandstone structure with green shutters and a reputation for keeping secrets. She located the file for Deputy Reams's accident. According to the report, he died on March 2, 2013, in a single-vehicle rollover west of Hanksville. The document listed Sheriff Mark Denlin as the certifying official. Ruth found that detail odd. Normally, a death certificate required the coroner's signature. She cross-referenced the listed autopsy and found it had been conducted by a contract pathologist who had since moved out of state. The name on the file, Dr. Lauren Amos, came up in only one other report, that of a hunter who died in a remote fire in 2012. Ruth jotted the name down. She had a feeling that two files under the same obscure examiner were not coincidence. While Ruth followed the paper trail, Nolan returned to the barn. Something about the voicemail haunted him. The sound of Megan's voice was more than just distress. It carried urgency, like she knew she would not have another chance. He played the message again, this time listening with his eyes closed. Toward the end, there was a strange background echo. It was faint, but present a mechanical whir, followed by the clink of metal. He replayed it several times and then walked outside to the edge of the pasture. Years ago, there had been a windmill near the old cattle pen, now dismantled and rusting in the field. He climbed over the gate and searched the ground around the old base. Buried beneath weeds and gravel, he found a small camera lens embedded in a metal housing. It was shattered, but its presence confirmed something Megan had once suspected. Someone had been watching the ranch. Nolan took the camera to Ruth. She examined the housing and found it manufactured by a company called Ridgepoint Security. The records showed the business had been contracted for only 2 clients in the county. One was the county courthouse. The other was a property listed as Denlin Holdings, LLC. Ruth followed the lead to a remote cabin east of the highway surrounded by state-protected land and not visible from the main road. She drove there the next morning, parking beneath a grove of twisted pines. The cabin was empty, but fresh tire tracks circled the front lot, and a single light bulb flickered in the back window. Ruth circled the structure and found a wire running from the basement to a dish mounted on the roof. Inside the basement, she found a locked trunk bolted to the floor. She photographed everything and returned to town. That evening, Ruth met with a retired deputy named Hank Lister, who had served under Sheriff Denlin in the early 2010s. Over coffee and hesitation, Hank admitted something he had carried for years. Deputy Reams had expressed concerns about Denlin's activities before his supposed accident. Reams had asked too many questions, and within weeks he was gone. The department was told he lost control of his vehicle. No one attended the autopsy. No one questioned the story. Hank showed Ruth an old photo of the department picnic in 2012. In the background, Megan stood next to Reams laughing. They had been friends, maybe more. Ruth reviewed the information again. Megan's note about KR, the timestamp on the voicemail, the badge in the bag. Reams had been with her that night, and now he was the one person buried in name only. Ruth called the medical examiner's office and asked for one last detail. She wanted to verify the dental records for the body buried as Kyle Reams. A young technician promised to get back to her. 2 days later, Ruth received a voicemail. The records had been rechecked. The dental pattern on file did not match Reams's military ID. The body in the grave belonged to someone else. The morning sun rose over Nolan Holloway's ranch with the quiet resolve of something returning to unfinished business. Nolan stood by the old corral gripping the worn handle of a coffee mug as steam curled into the air. His eyes scanned the far fence line where the ridge met the canyon edge. He had walked that stretch thousands of times over the years, boots cutting through frost and dust, searching for anything that might bring him closer to the truth. Now he understood why nothing ever surfaced. The truth had been buried by hands that knew how to hide it. Ruth arrived just after 8. She parked by the barn and stepped out with a single sheet of paper in her hand. The medical records had confirmed what they feared. The body in Deputy Kyle Reams's grave was not his. The dental charts proved it. That meant Reams had disappeared the same night as Megan or shortly after. Ruth handed Nolan the page and let him absorb it. His fingers gripped the edges tightly. He did not say anything right away. He just nodded and motioned her toward the house. They needed to talk about what Megan had seen before she vanished. Inside, Nolan pulled a cardboard box from a cabinet above the fridge. It was covered in old duct tape and labeled in faded marker. Megan's things. He placed it on the table and opened the top. Inside were her notebooks, loose photographs, receipts, and a small silver necklace with a turquoise pendant she had worn since high school. He removed a stack of papers, folded into a weathered envelope. He explained that Megan had found them in her mailbox 2 weeks before she disappeared. The photos showed something that had never sat right with him. Ruth spread them across the table. Most were grainy, likely taken from a distance using a long lens. One image showed Megan's red pickup at the edge of a private airstrip near Bluff Creek. Another showed several men offloading dark bags from a van into a twin-engine aircraft. The final photo focused on one man's face partially turned toward the camera. It was Sheriff Mark Denlin. The timestamp in the corner matched the week before Megan vanished. Nolan said she brought the photos to him in silence. She sat at the kitchen table, stared at them, then slid them across to him. She asked him if he thought she was in danger. He told her not to go back to that airstrip. She nodded, but something changed in her after that. She stopped smiling. She stopped sleeping. She kept a flashlight on in her room at night. Nolan had offered to call someone. She refused. She said she needed to figure it out herself. Now, he knew what she must have been preparing for. She knew something and had no one she could trust. Ruth asked if Megan had ever mentioned Reams during that time. Nolan hesitated, then nodded. Once, she had said he was the only person in uniform who still believed in right and wrong. That had struck Nolan as strange at the time, but now it made sense. If she had confided in Reams, and if he had tried to help her, they had both been targeted. Ruth took the notebook Megan had kept and began flipping through it again. Between the pages, she found a map drawn in pencil. It marked the edge of the pasture and a small hill known locally as Coyote Ridge. At the base of the hill, Megan had written a single-word meeting. Ruth and Nolan hiked to the ridge that afternoon. The sun bore down hard, but the wind off the canyon cooled the sweat on their backs. They followed the narrow path until they reached a hollow marked with scrub brush and a pile of flat rocks. Ruth bent down and swept some of the debris aside. Underneath, she found a small plastic casing. Inside was an old USB drive wrapped in electrical tape. Nolan stared at it in disbelief. She must have hidden it in case something went wrong. Back at the house, Ruth connected the drive to her laptop. It contained one video file timestamped January 3, 2013, 9:45 p.m. The image was dark, but steady. It showed Megan sitting in the driver's seat of her truck. The dashboard light illuminated her face. She was speaking directly to the camera. She said that if this video was found, it meant she had not made it home. She explained that she had seen Sheriff Denlin meeting with 2 men near Bluff Creek airstrip. She said she saw the exchange of duffel bags and weapons. She said she was going to meet with Deputy Reams to hand over the evidence. She warned that Denlin might suspect her already. The video ended with a shaky breath and one final sentence. She said she hoped someone would listen. Nolan leaned back in his chair, his eyes wet and fixed on the ceiling. He had failed to protect her, but now her voice was cutting through the silence Denlin had tried to build. Ruth backed up the file onto 3 separate drives. She knew the risks of holding on to something like this. Denlin still had influence in town. The old networks did not dissolve easily, especially when built over years of loyalty and silence. She called her contact at the bureau, a former analyst named Jonas Miller, now working independently. She sent him the video and asked him to run facial recognition on the other 2 men in the footage. She told him to hurry. The next morning, Jonas sent her a message. One of the men was identified as Barrett Sloan, a former contractor dishonorably discharged and now listed as deceased. The other man came back with a red flag. His name was Clayton Royce, a former federal marshal who had been tied to a missing persons case in New Mexico. He had vanished in 2014, but his bank account remained active through proxy deposits traced to a dummy company. That company's founding documents listed an address in Utah, an address matching Denlin Holdings. Ruth drove to the sheriff's department that day and asked for Sheriff Tanya Rhodes. She showed her the video and laid out everything they had found. Rhodes watched in silence. When it ended, she stood slowly and walked to the window. Then she ordered her office to open a formal internal investigation into Denlin's time as sheriff. She assigned a task force to review every closed file from 2010 to 2020. Ruth asked her one question before leaving. Was she ready for what they might find? Rhodes answered without hesitation. She said it was long overdue. That night, Nolan sat outside under the stars. The wind had picked up, stirring the dust in small spirals across the pasture. He thought about the girl. Megan had been the fire in her voice, the strength behind her silence. She had not run. She had tried to do the right thing. And someone had buried her truth because they thought no one would keep looking. They had miscalculated. Ruth Kim returned to her hotel room that night with her laptop pressed against her chest and her keys still clenched in her hand. The weight of what they had uncovered pressed heavier with every step. She spread out the USB files again on the desk, noting the video Megan had recorded and the names Jonas had confirmed. The names meant something. They built a picture of structure of links of control. The connection to Denlin Holdings added another layer to the corruption, a layer that touched federal contracts and outdated law enforcement ties. Ruth opened her notes and began building a timeline, one that tracked Megan's movements with Deputy Kyle Reams in the final days before they disappeared. She needed to know more about Reams. She needed to know why he vanished with Megan's trust in his pocket. The next morning, Ruth visited the Regional Law Enforcement Records Center, a beige building near the courthouse filled with silent clerks and outdated file cabinets. She submitted a request for Deputy Reams's full personnel file. The clerk at the desk frowned, explaining that the file had been flagged with a restricted access code. Ruth showed her investigator credentials, and the clerk disappeared for a few minutes before returning with a manila folder. Inside were standard documents training completion commendations assignments. But a few pages, and Ruth found something unusual. Reams had filed an internal complaint 3 months before his alleged death. The complaint listed inconsistencies in patrol logs and mentioned unexplained withdrawals from department funds. The person he named in the complaint was Sheriff Mark Denlin. The complaint had been dismissed with a single-page reply signed by Denlin himself. It claimed the discrepancies were clerical and closed the matter without investigation. Ruth made copies of everything. When she looked closer at Reams's last known assignment, she noticed his final patrol was not anywhere near Hanksville where the supposed accident happened. His last GPS ping came from an overlook south of Bluff Creek, the same place Megan had marked on her hand-drawn map. Ruth called Jonas again and asked if he could dig into Reams's financial records. She also asked him to check for any property listings, rentals, or land owned by Reams under alternate names. Jonas said he would call back in a few hours. Ruth left the records center and headed back toward Nolan's ranch. On the way, she stopped at a small diner for coffee and sat in the back booth near the window. While stirring cream into her cup, she noticed a man step inside. He was tall, with sun-darkened skin, wearing a windbreaker and hiking boots. His eyes scanned the room slowly before settling on her. He approached and asked if she was Ruth Kim. She nodded. He sat across from her without invitation. He introduced himself as Vincent Reams, older brother of Kyle. He said he heard Ruth had been asking about his brother and that the clerk at the records center had called him. Ruth asked if he had spoken to Kyle after the accident. Vincent shook his head. He said the last time he had seen Kyle was a week before the funeral. Kyle had been nervous, pacing in his truck outside Vincent's home. He said he was going to disappear for a while, said things were not safe. Vincent never told anyone because he assumed Kyle had been running from something internal, maybe depression or burnout. When the department called to report the crash, Vincent believed it had finally caught up to him. Ruth asked if Kyle had ever mentioned Megan Holloway. Vincent paused, then nodded. He said Kyle cared about her possibly more than he admitted. He said Kyle had called her brave and had once mentioned she had dirt on someone powerful. Ruth asked if Vincent thought Kyle was still alive. Vincent looked down at his coffee, then back up. He said he used to think so. Now he was not sure. But he added one more thing. On the night of Kyle's funeral, a security camera at Vincent's warehouse had picked up someone trying to enter the building. The footage was grainy, but the height, build, and gait resembled Kyle. When he called the sheriff's office, no one followed up. Back at the ranch, Nolan was waiting on the porch with an old binder in his lap. He said Megan had once mailed him a copy of her route schedule, the one she followed on ranch errands and deliveries. He had filed it away after her disappearance. Ruth opened the binder and noticed that on January 3, 2013, she had planned a delivery to the co-op outside of Bluff Creek. The route would have taken her directly past the canyon overlook where Reams's final GPS ping had come from. Ruth traced the line of the road with her finger and noted an unlabeled turnoff that ran parallel to an old mining trail. That evening, Ruth and Nolan drove out to the overlook, taking the same route Megan would have taken. They parked the truck and walked along the ridge. About 200 yards down the slope, Ruth spotted something metal glinting beneath the brush. She knelt and brushed away dirt and leaves. A rusted sign lay flat against the ground, nearly illegible. It read, West Hawk Monitoring Station. Ruth looked around. The site had been decommissioned over 20 years ago, but she noticed fresh footprints in the dirt nearby. They followed the path down to a small concrete structure built into the side of the hill. The door was half buried and rusted shut. Ruth pried it open with a tire iron from the truck. Inside, the air smelled of old water and mildew. The room had a table, a cot, and a plastic storage bin. Ruth opened the bin and found clothing, a radio, and several empty food containers. In the corner of the room was a folded jacket. Inside the pocket was a notebook. The first page read March 4, 2013. It was a journal. Ruth skimmed the entries. The writer described watching the sheriff's patrols from a distance, collecting evidence and waiting for the right time to come forward. He mentioned Megan's name multiple times, always in past tense. The final entry was dated September 2014. It ended abruptly with a single line. He found me. Ruth photographed every page and secured the notebook in her bag. Back at the ranch, she and Nolan reviewed the entries carefully. The handwriting matched Kyle Reams's personnel file. He had been alive for over a year after his supposed death. He had been hiding near the same road Megan vanished on. And someone had found him. The air that morning carried a dry stillness, as if the landscape itself held its breath. Ruth Kim stood at the edge of the overlook near the decommissioned monitoring station, her eyes focused on the trail of boot prints leading away from the entrance. The prints were not recent, but they had depth and pattern pressed hard into the soil by someone carrying weight or moving with urgency. She took photos from multiple angles using a ruler for scale. Nolan waited a few steps behind her, silent and watchful, letting her move with the precision that came from habit. Ruth turned toward him and said they needed to follow where those prints led, not back to the road, but in the direction of the canyon's southern rim where a patch of land was marked on her map as belonging to a defunct timber company. The title of ownership had never transferred again, which meant no one had officially touched the land in over a decade. Ruth had a different suspicion. She believed someone had used the ownership silence to cover their tracks. They returned to Nolan's house to regroup and run title searches through her laptop. Ruth pulled records from state land registries and local tax files, narrowing down parcels adjacent to the monitoring site. One tract stood out 40 acres registered to a shell company called Granite Pines, Inc. The listed address was a P.O. box in Kansas. Ruth contacted Jonas and asked him to run the corporate registration. He called back with the results in 20 minutes. Granite Pines had only one officer listed. His name was Dale Vickers, a former law enforcement consultant who had briefly served in Arches County under Denlin's administration before leaving without notice in 2013. The timeline aligned too closely to be ignored. Jonas added that Vickers had no fixed address but made monthly ATM withdrawals from a bank in Durango, Colorado. Ruth and Nolan left for the property by late afternoon. They took the back roads, rough gravel paths winding through pinon brush and sun-bleached fence posts. Ruth drove slow, scanning the terrain for unusual markings. After an hour, they reached a rusted gate tied shut with a twisted barbed wire. A hand-painted sign read "No Trespassing" and hung crooked on one nail. Ruth climbed out and cut the wire with bolt cutters, stepping carefully over the threshold. The dirt road continued another 100 yards, curving out of view behind a low ridge. They left the truck and approached on foot. At the crest of the ridge, they stopped. Below them sat a cabin, low-roofed and gray with flaking paint and boarded windows. A green tarp covered something beside the porch. Ruth raised her binoculars and studied the scene. There were no vehicles, no movement, no visible surveillance. But the soil around the structure had been disturbed. Lines in the dirt traced the shape of tires and human footprints overlapping in confusion. Ruth and Nolan descended slowly, following the trail past what looked like an old storage shed. The door hung open slightly, revealing shelves lined with rusted tools and empty crates. Behind the cabin, they found the tarp-covered object. Ruth pulled the fabric back and revealed an industrial generator. It looked recently used. Dust had not yet settled on the engine casing. She turned back to Nolan and told him someone had been here within the past week. Inside the cabin, they stepped carefully, each board beneath their feet, creaking like a warning. The front room held a couch covered in plastic sheeting, a folding table with a disconnected landline, and a battered armchair facing a cold fireplace. But it was the back room that stopped Ruth cold. A narrow hallway led to a single room at the rear of the structure. The door was shut, but not locked. When Ruth opened it, the stale air hit her first, then the smell of damp cloth and metal. Inside, the walls were lined with insulation boards, the windows sealed with heavy black plastic. A mattress lay on the floor, stained and sagging. Chains were bolted into the baseboards, and on the far wall, tally marks had been scratched into the drywall. Ruth approached slowly. She counted over 100 marks, each one carved carefully, consistently. Next to them, a small plastic bag held a tuft of blonde hair and a silver ring. Nolan exhaled through clenched teeth. He took one step back and leaned against the doorframe. He recognized the ring. Megan had worn it every day for 3 years. He had bought it for her 22nd birthday, a thick silver band etched with a horse's silhouette. Ruth snapped photos, then sealed the bag in an evidence pouch. She took a wide scan of the room and noted every item. There were no lights, no mirrors, no calendar, no clock. Whoever had stayed here had been kept in silence and darkness. Ruth reached into a drawer of a small nightstand and found a notebook. The cover was blank, the paper inside damp but readable. The entries were written in different handwriting from Reams's journal. They were shorter, more fragmented. Many ended mid-sentence. Some pages were ripped. One entry said simply, "He comes in the morning," then nothing. Another page said the same line 3 times, "Do not speak, do not look, do not move." The final page held a single word written in large, shaky letters, "Help." They left the cabin without touching anything else. Ruth marked the GPS location and took a soil sample from outside the rear window. Back at the truck, Nolan gripped the steering wheel but did not start the engine. He asked Ruth if she thought Megan had been held there. Ruth said it looked like a secondary location, a place to break people before moving them elsewhere. Nolan did not respond. He stared down the road, his jaw set hard. Ruth placed a hand on the dash. She told him they had enough for a warrant and for the task force to take the next step. That night, Ruth submitted a report to Sheriff Rhodes attaching photos, location data, and ownership links. Rhodes responded within an hour, issuing an emergency search request and contacting the State Bureau of Investigation. Ruth then forwarded the material to Jonas for backup storage. Before turning in, she reread the notebook from the cabin. The pages made her chest tighten. They were not just scribbles. They were windows into something stripped of time and humanity. She thought of Megan then, of others who may have been taken, each one marked not by a headline, but by absence. The morning after their discovery at the cabin, Ruth Kim awoke before sunrise. Her sleep had been thin and restless, broken by flashes of Megan's ring, the tally marks on the wall, the way the words in the notebook bled off into silence. She stepped out onto the motel walkway, sipping black coffee as the sky turned slowly from slate to orange. She opened her laptop on the hood of her car and reviewed the digital files she had uploaded the night before. She had scanned the photos again, pausing on the scratched wall and the final page of the notebook. She zoomed in on the word help and studied the way the letters slanted, rushed but sharp, the way someone wrote when time was short or fear had sunk too deep. Ruth closed the laptop and started her engine. She had one more angle to chase before the sun hit the top of the cliffs. She needed to know if the person buried as Kyle Reams was really someone else, and why no one had asked sooner. By midday, Ruth was standing in the back corridor of the Arches County Medical Examiner's office. The building was quiet, the hallway dimly lit with sun filtering through tinted windows. A young technician named Carlos met her outside the cold storage unit, holding a clipboard and rubbing sleep from his eyes. She had called ahead and requested access to archived dental records and autopsy reports. Carlos led her to the file room and rolled out the drawer marked 2013. They worked in silence for several minutes, sorting through paperwork and comparing digital scans. When they found the report listed under Reams, Ruth flipped through the autopsy summary and stopped at the last page. The examiner's notes described multiple rib fractures, blunt force trauma, and partial incineration. But one line stood out. No fingerprints retrieved due to fire damage. Identification presumed based on uniform and personal items. Ruth leaned against the table and rubbed her forehead. Presumed meant no confirmed match. She asked Carlos if the dental comparison had ever been run against Reams's military file. He said no, but the archived jawbone samples had not been destroyed. With Ruth's approval and the sheriff's authorization, they compared the samples that afternoon. The results came in 3 hours later. The remains buried under Reams's name were not a match. The dental profile belonged to a different man. Carlos found no DNA on file for the body and no confirmed ID. That meant someone had planted a uniform and burned the body to pass it off as Reams. Ruth thanked Carlos and stepped outside, feeling the sun press down hard on her shoulders. The weight of another buried truth sat deeper now. She called Nolan and asked him to meet at the sheriff's office. They sat in the conference room with Sheriff Rhodes and reviewed everything again. The false identification, the location of the cabin, the photo of Megan's ring. Rhodes listened closely and did not interrupt. When Ruth finished, the sheriff leaned forward and said the timeline could no longer be ignored. She authorized a formal request to exhume the body and cross-reference it against missing persons from surrounding counties. Ruth nodded, but said she already had a suspicion about who the body might belong to. A month before Megan vanished, a part-time technician at the local water treatment plant named Alan Voss had gone missing. He had no family locally, no formal missing persons report, but Ruth remembered the name from a side note in Megan's journal. Alan had helped her once with a broken fuse box on the ranch. The date of his disappearance lined up with the first signs of pressure in Megan's entries. Ruth asked Jonas to pull employment records for Alan Voss and look for any shared connections with Denlin or his associates. Jonas called back the next morning. Voss had been briefly hired by the county maintenance department under a program supervised by Denlin's office. No other records existed. His last known paycheck was issued 1 week before the body was discovered in Reams's alleged accident. Ruth and Nolan drove out to the crash site listed in the original report. It was a bend in the road near a ravine east of Hanksville. The guardrail had long since been replaced, but Ruth studied the terrain closely. The embankment had been burned, but only in a specific semicircle. She'd followed the edge of the scorched area and found remnants of accelerant markers. Whoever staged the accident had poured fuel in a controlled line to simulate a rollover, but no tire marks led to the edge. The vehicle had not crashed naturally. It had been placed and ignited. Ruth took photos of the soil scanned for residual chemicals and marked the angle of the fire's path. She turned to Nolan and said it had all been staged. Someone needed Kyle Reams to disappear, and someone needed Alan Voss to stay forgotten. The following day, Jonas sent her another file. He had traced a rental truck signed out in the name of Dale Vickers on March 1, 2013. The vehicle had been returned with high mileage and traces of blood in the cargo bay, but no charges were filed. The inspection note claimed the stains were paint from old equipment. Ruth compared the mileage with the distance from Vickers' registered address to the crash site and found they aligned exactly. She submitted the findings to Sheriff Rhodes and contacted the Bureau liaison for assistance. The pieces now fit with sharp edges. While investigators began their own search of properties linked to Denlin and Vickers, Ruth turned her attention back to the names in Megan's notebook. One name was circled repeatedly. Latham. The handwriting next to it read Second Silo. No address, no coordinates, just a name and the phrase next to tracks. Ruth asked Jonas to run satellite scans of the region surrounding Granite Pines and the old Overlook site. He filtered images for structures adjacent to rail lines and located 2 candidates. One had already been searched. The other sat near the county line behind a rock quarry marked as inactive. Ruth drove there the next day with a warrant in her hand and a loaded recorder in her jacket pocket. At the site, the silo stood like a shadow. The paint peeled. The doors chained. A padlock held shut with rusted metal. But a recent tire track curved around the side. Ruth walked the perimeter and found a trapdoor built into the base of the structure. She pried it open with the crowbar and descended into the darkness. The air was cold sour with rot and mildew. Her flashlight revealed a corridor lined with sheet metal and cinder blocks. At the end was a hatch sealed from the outside. She turned the handle and opened the door. Inside the chamber were 2 cots, a broken lantern, and 2 thin blankets. A plastic crate held unopened canned goods and a first aid kit. On the wall, a message was scratched in stone. "We are still here." Ruth stood frozen, then moved toward the crate. Underneath the supplies was a leather-bound planner. She opened it. The first page said, Megan Holloway, 2015. It was her handwriting. The sun had already dipped behind the sandstone cliffs when Ruth Kim climbed out of the silo with the planner still in her hands. The name on the inside cover sat heavy in her chest. Megan Holloway, 2015. 2 full years after the night she vanished from Nolan's ranch. That simple detail shifted everything. Megan had not just survived the first phase of captivity. She had endured it long enough to begin counting the years. Ruth placed the book on the passenger seat, wiped her hands clean with a towel from her kit, and called Sheriff Rhodes. She reported the discovery described the interior layout and requested a forensic team be dispatched by morning. Rhodes said she would send units and secure the site. Ruth sat still for a while, her mind running through timelines and missing pieces. She kept coming back to the fact that Megan had been there, alive, writing, leaving signals. That night, back in town, Ruth opened the planner and began reading. The entries were brief, often incomplete, some written with what looked like pencil, others smudged from dampness or panic. The first few pages tracked the days with tally marks. Then came fragments. One page read no sunlight 2 weeks. Another said he said I am leverage. On a torn piece tucked between pages she wrote heard truck, today same sound as before. On the final page a date was written. October 6, 2015. Next to it, Megan had scribbled the words move again. Ruth took a breath and copied the entries by hand into her own notebook. She recognized the shift in tone. Megan had expected to be relocated. She might have been moved to another holding site. Ruth needed to find that trail before time erased it completely. The next morning, Ruth met Nolan at the sheriff's office. She handed him a copy of the final entry, but not the original. She wanted to preserve it for forensics. Nolan held the page as if it might disappear. He read the words in silence. His eyes narrowed when he reached the word leverage. He asked Ruth if she thought Megan had seen too much, or if she was being used as insurance. Ruth said she suspected both. The timing, the effort, the elaborate layers of concealment all pointed to Megan witnessing something she was not meant to see, something serious enough for others to risk everything to keep her hidden. Nolan asked where she thought they took her after the silo. Ruth replied that she had one lead, and it was thin, but it might be enough to open a path. She returned to the Granite Pines land registry file and pulled an old topo map of the area near the first bunker and the silo. A line drawn in faint red traced the route of a decommissioned service tunnel built in the early 1980s for oil transport testing. The project had been shut down due to landslides, and the tunnels were assumed to have collapsed. But Ruth's overlay of recent drone imagery showed a pattern of disturbed soil and collapsed fencing along the projected route. She marked the path which ran from the bluff above the cabin all the way to the backside of the quarry where the silo stood. It connected both locations. If the tunnel was intact or partially usable, it could have served as a secure route for moving captives without using public roads. By noon, Ruth had secured permission from Rhodes to explore the mapped route. She enlisted 2 deputies and Nolan, who refused to stay behind. They met at the ridge with flashlights, gloves, and water packs. The mouth of the tunnel lay behind a cracked retaining wall, partially hidden under thick brush and layers of fallen stone. Ruth used a crowbar to pry back the slabs. A gust of cold air spilled from the opening. It carried the smell of damp earth and rusted steel. One deputy dropped a stone inside. It hit bottom within seconds. Ruth clicked on her flashlight and stepped in first. The interior was dark, wide enough for a single person at a time. Metal supports lined the walls, many warped by time. Graffiti from decades earlier still lingered on parts of the structure. They moved slowly, light dancing across broken rails and pieces of pipe. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, they found the first chamber. It had once housed a generator station. Now it was empty but for a pile of flattened cardboard and an old milk crate. Inside the crate was a blanket and 2 empty water bottles with labels dated 2014. Nolan bent down and picked up a bootlace. It was pink. He said Megan had worn boots like that during her last winter on the ranch. They continued deeper. The tunnel bent east and sloped downward. The temperature dropped. They found the second chamber just as the air began to feel heavy. A steel door leaned against the wall. Its hinges were still attached. Inside, the room looked like a temporary holding area. Bolted chains hung from a beam. A chemical toilet sat in the corner. The floor was stained with mold. On the wall, scratched into the paint with something sharp, were the words, "I am not gone." Ruth reached out and touched the letters. They had been dug in with force. The edges curled inward from pressure. She took a photograph, then scanned the room for anything left behind. In the corner, under a pile of broken crates, she found a spoon with an engraved handle. She handed it to Nolan. His face tightened. He said it came from their kitchen. They emerged from the tunnel after nearly 2 hours, dirty and quiet. The exit led to a service road hidden behind a tall ridge covered in pine. A set of tire impressions marked the trail shallow but recent. Ruth looked at the direction and noted they turned south. She followed the road to a break in the brush and found a path marked by flattened weeds. Beyond that, footprints scattered across the dry dirt. Some large boot-shaped, one smaller, barefoot. She measured the prints. The smaller set belonged to someone light, narrow, feet-deep impression. Likely a woman. Likely Megan. Ruth returned to town and updated Rhodes, who coordinated with the Bureau to dispatch search units along the trail. Ruth remained behind to study the tunnel again with a mapping team. Before they left, she walked back to the scratched message on the wall. "I am not gone." It stayed with her longer than she expected. 3 days passed with no forward movement. The Bureau's search units traced the tire tracks south through the pine ridges and into a stretch of land owned by a livestock broker. but the trail ended at a clearing near a dry creek bed. There were no structures, no signs of recent activity, and the footprints had been trampled by wind and animal crossings. Ruth Kim sat at the sheriff's office that evening surrounded by maps, photographs, and timelines. She'd studied the planner again, rereading Megan's last entries. Move again, she had written. The date had been October 6, 2015. Ruth cross-checked that date against vehicle logs from local checkpoints and found a single match that stood out. A black SUV had passed a private gate near the Utah-Colorado border late that night. The driver's name on the gate entry was Dale Vickers. He had used a badge number linked to a contract security clearance. Ruth contacted Jonas and asked if there had been any confirmed sightings or transactions involving Vickers since the trail went cold. Jonas sent a ping alert that flagged 2 weeks prior. A man matching Vickers' description had purchased diesel fuel in northern New Mexico using a prepaid card tied to a Shell account. Ruth pulled the location. It was near a former copper mine leased briefly in 2014 by a company known as Red Bend Services. That name had come up in a footnote once before, tied to a supply invoice linked to Denland's holdings. Ruth packed her files, called Nolan, and said they were heading south. The drive took 6 hours. They passed long stretches of highway bordered by empty ranch land and clusters of shale outcrops. The air grew thinner, colder as they approached the elevation changes near the mining region. Red Bend's listed coordinates led them to a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. A padlock secured the main gate. No company signage remained, only a faded warning about hazardous terrain. Ruth scaled the gate while Nolan passed her gear through the gap. They moved slowly up the gravel path until the mine entrance came into view. The opening had been sealed with concrete years ago, but Ruth's drone sweep showed ventilation shafts still intact. She approached one of the shafts and noticed a small rectangular patch of disturbed soil nearby. She knelt, brushed the dirt back gently, and uncovered a steel hatch. The edges were scraped recently. Someone had moved it. She signaled to Nolan, and together they pulled the hatch free. Below them, a metal ladder dropped into blackness. Ruth switched on her flashlight and descended first. The ladder shook slightly with each step, but it held. After 20 feet, she reached a stone floor and turned in a slow circle. The tunnel ahead was reinforced with wooden beams, newer than the original structure. The air smelled of oil rust and something else she could not name. Nolan joined her moments later. They moved forward in silence, their boots crunching against gravel. The tunnel curved to the right, narrowing. After a few minutes, they came upon a door, steel, thick, painted gray. Ruth placed her ear against it and listened. She heard nothing. She turned the handle slowly. It was unlocked. The door creaked open into a narrow hallway lined with plywood walls and stripped insulation. A generator hummed faintly in the distance. They followed the sound until they reached a room lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Inside the room was a man in his 50s, seated at a desk with a radio in front of him. He turned slowly, eyes dull but not surprised. Ruth stepped forward and said his name. Dale Vickers. He did not deny it. He raised his hands without resistance. Ruth asked if Megan Holloway was still alive. Vickers said she had been taken from this site 8 years ago. He claimed he did not know where they moved her. Ruth asked who gave the orders. Vickers said the instructions came from a private number linked to a man named Rylan Kess, another former contractor tied to Ridgepoint Security. Ruth restrained him and radioed for backup. Nolan remained in the hallway, his fists clenched. He said nothing. When the Bureau agents arrived, they searched the compound thoroughly. In a locked room beneath the floor, they found traces of captivity, thin blankets, ration boxes, 2 restraints mounted to the wall. One wall bore scratches. Not words, just lines, countless lines, each spaced a finger apart, carved into wood. Ruth counted more than 300. There was no sign of blood, no sign of who made the marks, but each one felt like a breath held in stone. Outside the compound, Ruth stood beside Nolan near the Bureau truck. She told him that Vickers was being taken into custody and would be held until federal charges were filed. Nolan asked again if Megan had been there. Ruth said yes and no. She had been once. But not anymore. They stared out at the hills, the wind bending the tops of the dry grass in waves. Ruth said they needed to go back to the source, the name Megan had written in her planner. Kess. It was time to find him. 2 days later, Jonas tracked a known alias used by Rylan Kess. A vehicle registered to that name had received a parking citation in Albuquerque near a warehouse district. Ruth and Nolan traveled there with federal agents. The address led them to a nondescript building surrounded by broken pavement and graffiti. Inside, a metal staircase led to a second-floor office. The space smelled of old coffee and printer ink. Ruth opened a desk drawer and found documents, shipping records, hard drives, a burner phone. The phone's log showed a recent text. It read, "Transfer confirmed, drop site maintained." She handed the phone to the tech team. They pulled location data and decrypted 2 messages. One included coordinates for a remote ranch west of Los Lunas. The other bore a code phrase used in previous trafficking cases. "Safe field cleared." Ruth looked at Nolan. They had one more place to search. The next morning, the federal task force moved in on the ranch. It was isolated, surrounded by cottonwoods and dry riverbeds. Ruth and Nolan waited just outside the perimeter while agents approached in formation. They breached the front door, swept the property, and searched the outbuildings. Inside one of the barns, they found a hidden room built into the back wall. A cot, a small sink, a steel loop embedded in the floor, and in the corner a photograph taped to the wall. A woman with dark hair stood beside a tree holding a dog. Her eyes were tired, but they were open. Ruth stepped inside the room and stared at the photo. It was printed from a grainy surveillance frame. The timestamp read September 2023, 1 year earlier. Megan had been alive then, and someone had kept a record. She turned to Nolan. He stood silently, hand on the doorframe, jaw tight. He whispered that he had never stopped believing. Ruth nodded. Neither had she. The sky over Los Lunas that morning was pale and colorless, drained of warmth by an approaching storm. Ruth Kim stood on the edge of the barn's rear lot, where the search teams had cordoned off the property with crime scene tape and metal barriers. The surveillance photo they found inside the hidden room sat in her coat pocket, printed twice, once for her and once for Nolan. He held his copy gently, as if the paper could tear without warning. The woman in the photo was not smiling, but her posture, the faint lift in her chin, the slight bend in her knees, all pointed to life. It was not a photo of someone trapped. It was a photo of someone waiting. The timestamp in the corner gave them a window. September 2023. Less than a year ago. Megan had still been alive then. That fact had the weight of a shout inside a silent room. Nolan leaned against the barn wall and asked how far they would take this. Ruth answered without pause. Until Megan came home. He nodded and folded the photo into his wallet, placing it behind a faded image of her at age 16 in a field of wheat. Ruth pulled her phone and made another call to Jonas. She asked for updates on financial transfers tied to Rylan Kess or Red Bend Services. Jonas told her that one flagged transaction had occurred just 3 weeks prior through a false vendor account. The account had been used to rent a 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Belen, New Mexico. The name on the lease was not Kess, but the background check revealed a forged identity connected to one of his known aliases. Federal teams moved that afternoon. Ruth and Nolan waited at a distance as agents breached the residence quietly and swiftly. The front door was reinforced but not locked. Inside, the home looked ordinary at first. A worn couch scattered newspapers, dishes in the sink. But in the back behind a locked utility room, they found another door with a magnetic seal. Behind it was a small room with blackout curtains, a narrow bed, and a portable toilet. And in the far corner, crouched and shielding her face from the sudden light, was a woman. Her hair was uneven, her frame thin, her clothes layered despite the heat. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply looked up at the first person who entered the room and whispered one word. Nolan. He did not hesitate. He stepped forward, dropped to one knee beside her, and placed a hand on her arm. She blinked slowly, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. He said her name once softly. She leaned into him and exhaled a long sound that trembled with effort. Ruth stepped inside quietly and gave the signal for medical support. Paramedics moved gently, assessing her condition. Megan resisted, at first flinching at every movement. It took time for her to realize she was safe. One of the agents handed Ruth a small journal found under the bed. It contained short entries just like the previous planner. The last entry read, "I heard his voice again." It was real this time. They transported Megan to the University Hospital in Albuquerque under federal protection. Ruth rode in the vehicle behind the ambulance, staring at the taillights through the streaked windshield. Nolan remained by Megan's side during the entire transport, his hand gripping hers tightly. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what Ruth feared. Megan had been malnourished, sedated periodically, and had suffered minor fractures in her left wrist that had healed improperly. Despite the damage, her mind was intact. Her memory was clear. When Ruth entered the room later that evening, Megan turned her head slowly and recognized her. She asked if the sheriff was gone. Ruth answered yes. Megan nodded and closed her eyes. She whispered that she had waited even when she stopped believing anyone was coming. Over the next 3 days, Megan rested and regained strength. Ruth coordinated with prosecutors, field agents, and federal liaisons to prepare for testimony. Megan agreed to give a full statement. She asked that Ruth and Nolan be present. In the conference room at the hospital's security wing, Megan sat across from the lead investigator and told her story from the beginning. She described the first night at the silo, the darkness, the isolation, the movement every time someone new arrived. She detailed how her captors used fear routine and silence as weapons. She recounted the sound of trucks, the whispers through vents, the time she heard other voices and knew she was not alone. She spoke of Reams. She said he had tried to help. She said he had brought her a knife once hidden in his boot and had promised they would leave. But that night he never returned. She believed they caught him. After that, the threats grew worse. They moved her more frequently. She described the tunnels, the underground cells, the cabin with the markings on the wall. When asked how she had escaped, Megan said she had not. She had been released weeks before Ruth found her. She believed Kess and his associates panicked after the surveillance photo was taken. She remembered being driven for hours, then left alone in the house in Belen. She was told someone would come for her eventually. But no one ever did. Megan's voice never wavered. She finished her statement and placed the pen on the table. She looked at Ruth and said they always underestimated silence. Ruth reached across the table and said they would never forget her words. Later that week, Megan was transferred to a rehabilitation center under federal watch. Nolan stayed close by. Ruth met with agents to finalize charges against Kess Vickers and the remaining members of the trafficking ring. Additional arrests followed in New Mexico, Texas, and Colorado. Red Bend Services was dismantled, and several former law enforcement officials were brought in for questioning. Megan's testimony served as the spine of the case. Her memories became the map that unraveled the rest. The courtroom sat in heavy silence as the final witness stepped down, and the judge adjusted the stack of papers on the bench with a deliberate care. The walls seemed to hold the weight of every word spoken since the trial began. Each detail from Megan's testimony, a stone added to the scale of justice. Ruth Kim sat in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap, her notes untouched since the afternoon began. She had heard it all before in interviews and transcripts and recordings, but hearing it spoken aloud under oath had been something different. It was not just a story anymore. It was a reckoning drawn into the light with no way back into the dark. Nolan Holloway sat one row ahead, his eyes fixed on the man seated at the defense table. Rylan Kess wore a gray suit and a flat expression. He had not looked at Megan once during her testimony. He had not responded when the agents listed his aliases or when the photos of the underground rooms were shown to the jury. He sat still, untouched by emotion, as if the trial were just another inconvenience to outlast. But everyone else in the room knew what this was. It was the end. The judge read the verdict, slowly letting each count carry its weight. Guilty on human trafficking. Guilty on unlawful confinement. Guilty on conspiracy to obstruct justice. Guilty on the disappearance and false imprisonment of Megan Holloway. Guilty on the death of Deputy Kyle Reams. As the final count echoed through the room, Megan remained composed. Her hands rested in her lap, her posture steady. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She listened with the kind of quiet only learned through long silences and darker places. The sentence followed. Life without parole, no possibility of release. The gavel struck the block and the air seemed to shift. People stood. Lawyers shook hands. Reporters scribbled notes. Ruth stayed seated watching Megan as the courtroom slowly emptied. Outside, the day was bright and dry. The wind moved through the trees without sound. Megan stepped into the light wearing a long-sleeved blouse and jeans that hung loose around her frame. The scars on her wrists were covered, but they remained beneath the fabric like faint watermarks on a letter long folded. She walked to the edge of the courthouse steps where Nolan stood waiting. He offered no words. He just opened his arms, and she stepped into them with a soft exhale. They stood that way for a long time, as if time itself had paused to witness them. Ruth watched from a short distance, then turned away to give them privacy. She knew there were no words needed in that moment. The journey had written enough. In the weeks that followed, Megan remained under protection while recovering both physically and emotionally. She received daily therapy, worked with counselors, and wrote often in silence. Her doctors said her memory was sharp and intact, though the trauma she carried might never leave fully. She was not interested in erasing what happened. She told Ruth she wanted to remember. Remembering was how she stayed free. Remembering was how she honored the part of her that had survived. She spent afternoons walking slowly along the hospital garden paths, tracing the stones with her fingers and watching the wind bend the tall grass. She spoke little to most people, but with Nolan and Ruth, her words began to return. One afternoon she asked Ruth to drive her to the pasture behind the old ranch. The roads were familiar and unchanged. The cattle moved slowly under the wide sky. The barn still leaned slightly to the left. The fence posts remained chipped where the old truck had scraped against them years ago. They stood near the ridge, the grass brushing against their knees. Megan said she used to picture this place during the worst moments. She said it helped her believe something beyond the walls existed. Ruth asked what she saw now. Megan said she saw peace but also something unfinished. She looked out across the land and said she was not done speaking. That fall, Megan gave her first and only interview. It was filmed in a quiet room with no cameras allowed except one. She spoke clearly, slowly recounting her years in captivity, the people who hurt her, and the small victories she found in surviving each day. She named those who betrayed her. She thanked those who kept looking. She said names mattered. She said truth had edges that could not be dulled just because it made others uncomfortable. She said silence was not the same as safety. When the interview aired, it did not draw outrage or spectacle. It drew something deeper. People listened. People paused. People remembered her name. The investigation that followed expanded far beyond what anyone expected. Red Bend services had touched networks across multiple states. Former deputies, private contractors, and even corporate vendors fell under scrutiny. Megan's testimony became the cornerstone for federal indictments. More survivors came forward, each carrying pieces of the same pattern. They spoke because she had. They remembered because she had survived long enough to show it mattered. Ruth attended each new hearing. She sat behind each survivor, quietly taking notes, watching justice collect its dues one voice at a time. Nolan returned to the ranch full-time. He did not rebuild what had been lost. He let the broken fence stay where it sagged. He let the scrape on the post remain visible. He did not want to pretend nothing had happened. He wanted it to be real and seen and remembered. Megan stayed nearby in a small house on the edge of the property, one with wide windows and a wooden desk that faced the morning sun. She wrote there each day, sometimes with her sleeves pushed back, sometimes with music playing softly in the background. She did not speak much of the dark anymore. She did not need to. She lived beyond it. One evening, Ruth visited the ranch and sat on the porch beside Megan. The sun dipped below the hills and left behind a copper glow across the field. Ruth asked if she'd planned to write a book. Megan said maybe. Then she paused and said not yet. Ruth nodded and sipped her tea. Megan said some stories needed to sit in the soil for a while before they could be lifted. She said not everything needed to be loud to matter. Ruth agreed. Then they sat in silence listening to the cicadas rise with the night. Months later, a plaque was installed near the courthouse steps. It bore no quotes or dedications, just one sentence. She returned. She endured. She remembered. Megan stood beside it during the quiet ceremony, her hand resting on the stone surface. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her presence spoke more than words ever could. If this story moved, you take a moment to like and subscribe for more true-to-life narratives that deserve to be heard. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.